Camera speed.
Sound production, take one.
Action!
Welcome to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. If you love old movies, Hollywood history, or the golden age of filmmaking, you've come to the right place. This is the podcast that talks about amazing stories of Tinseltown from another era. Hear fascinating conversations with writer-producer Steve Cubine, who quite literally lives just beneath the Hollywood sign, and actress-writer Nan McNamara. Now your hosts, Steve and Nan.
Nan, today is a really special day for us because today marks the 1-year anniversary that we started the podcast.
Yes, the anniversary of the first episode being dropped. Woo!
Can you believe it?
I can't believe it. A whole year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary, Lindsay.
Happy anniversary, guys.
And we have some exciting news to share.
Yes, we do. We have been extended for another year with our fantastic network, Airwave. And so we'll be bringing you guys more stories about old Hollywood for the next year.
Yes, we will indeed.
Season 2, baby.
Yes.
Season 2 is here.
Season 2 begins with this episode.
And I think it's a really appropriate episode to kick off because we're going to be talking about a couple of horror icons in honor of Halloween.
Yes.
And we were just saying before we started recording, I think these two gentlemen were probably my introduction into classic cinema because these would have been the films, Frankenstein and Dracula, and now you know who we're going to talk about, that I would have first seen as a young girl, and they scared the heck out of me.
Oh, me too. I could not get enough, though. I love
Me
these
too.
movies.
Me too.
You know, good old Universal. They just created the most incredible monsters.
Yes. So let's kick it off by talking about Dracula.
Yes. Nice accent.
Thank you very much. I just came up with that. Of course, we're talking about BELA Lugosi. BELA Lugosi was originally born Bela Ferenc Dejo Blasco on October 20th, 1882. He was born in Lugos, Hungary, but get this, located on the western border of the Transylvanian Alps.
Well, of course.
I mean, is that not just prescient,
That's
right?
perfect.
That's now Lugos, Romania. He was the youngest of 4 children born to Paula and Istvan Blasco. Now, his father was a banker. And as we know, as kids that came out here to Hollywood with probably our parents cringing at us wanting to pursue the entertainment industry, so it was for Bela. His father wanted him to take a conventional career path, but Bela pretty much knew from a very early age he did not like school and he wanted to be an actor. They butted heads. There was a rift between him and his parents. He quit school at age 12 and he left home and he never returned.
Wow, at 12?
12 years old.
My gosh.
Yes. After a year of no contact, unfortunately, he learned of his father's death. He continued working various jobs. He was determined to be an actor, and he hung out at a stage door hoping that someone would give him a chance, and eventually they did.
Oh, wow. That's a cool way to be discovered.
Right? So he was 20 years old when he performed his first recorded performance, and he worked in a number of regional theaters in Hungary. And as I understand it, during this time period, it was actually considered the golden age of Hungarian theater.
He played roles in film and theater under different names, but eventually adopted Bela Lugosi after the town where he was born. At age 28, he got a big break, taking over the role of Romeo in Romeo and Juliet.
Yes.
Can you imagine Dracula as Romeo?
Well, he was quite the good-looking young man, and those eyes that worked so well
Yes.
for Dracula, they worked really well.
I've seen young pictures of him, and he was a stud.
Yeah, he was really a stud. Well, by 1913, he's invited to join the National Theatre of Budapest, cast in supporting roles, but he's working his way up. This is when World War I began. As an actor in the National Theatre, actors were actually exempt from serving.
They were?
Yeah.
I never knew that.
Isn't that wild?
Oh, wow.
At least in Hungary, they were, yeah. So he joined the front lines anyway, though. He was on the Army Ski Patrol. He unfortunately was injured, but he received the equivalent of the Purple Heart for his injuries.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So when World War I ended, he went back to the National Theatre, and over the course of his theater career in Hungary, he played all of the classic roles. I mean, he played Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, Taming of the Shrew, Richard III. And he even played, and his son is quoted as saying this was a big hit for him, He played Jesus Christ. So he can play the dark and the light,
I was
baby.
going to say, the darkest of the dark, the lightest of the light.
No, right?
He can cover them all.
Yes, yes.
That's funny.
Bela married in 1917 Ilona Smik, but the marriage was not a good match. Her parents didn't approve of his unstable actor life. And added to that, post-World War I, Lugosi found himself on the wrong side of the revolution in Hungary. And so he was forced to flee with his new wife to Vienna in 1919. Her parents forced her to return to Hungary, and they soon filed for divorce. Now, Bela Lugosi's son is actually quoted as this first love of his is perhaps somebody that he continued to love for the rest of his life.
Oh, how tragic.
I know.
Oh, that's too bad. After that, he went to Berlin, where he had small roles in films. But he was unhappy in Germany, so he headed to the United States in 1920, where he landed in New Orleans and then moved to New York City. He was granted political asylum there.
Right. In 1921, he married actress Ilona von Montag. And here's the thing. He still didn't know English. So, what do you do if you're an actor in New York City and you don't know English? You start a Hungarian repertory company.
Sure, they were lined up to get into that.
Right. Well, I think there were actually a lot of Hungarians in New York at the time. So, when he was eventually cast in English plays, when he first started out, he actually learned the dialogue phonetically.
Oh, wow.
Because he did not know the language.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah. Isn't that wild?
Yeah, that is wild. In 1922, at the age of 40, he was cast in his first English-speaking play called The Red Poppy on Broadway. Apparently, his lovemaking on stage with the actress was so passionate that he bruised his leading lady's ribs.
Isn't that wild?
I know. So he was put forward then as a sex symbol.
Yes, of course. You're going to hear that story and you're going to go, we know what to do with that guy. Now, his accent really was limiting him, though, in terms of what he could be cast in. He was usually bad guys or foreigners. He was in a number of silent films. His American film debut was in The Silent Command, 1923, playing a spy who's trying to blow up the Panama Canal. And he continued in silence through 1927. He had appeared in nearly 35 films, in addition to all the theater we already talked about, but all in small parts.
Oh, wow. His marriage to Ilona number 2 ended in 1925. She charged him with adultery and complaining that he wanted her to abandon her acting career to keep house for him, which she wasn't about to do.
Right. Now, 1927, however, is going to be a big life-changing year for him. He's offered the lead in an English stage production that was coming to Broadway. Now, he initially turns it down. So the actor that originated the role in London, Raymond Huntley, he was asked to come to New York City and do it on Broadway. He turned it down. The producers came back to Bela Lugosi, and he said yes. And you know what the play was?
What?
Dracula.
Life-changing.
He was 44 years old, and he became a star.
Wow.
Yeah, the
late
production.
bloomer.
I know, very, very late bloomer. The production ran on Broadway for 261 performances. It took New York by storm, and it was followed by 2 years of touring. While he was on tour with the play in California, he decided to stay in LA.
And on July 27th, 1929, he married for a third time a wealthy San Francisco resident named Beatrice Woodruff Weeks. But just 3 months later, she filed for divorce, accusing Lugosi of infidelity with Clara Bow, the It Girl.
The It Girl, yes. Now, his first significant film role is in The 13th Chair, 1929. Now, this is significant for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's directed by Todd Browning,
Yes,
who would
great.
direct him 2 years later in Dracula. This film also brought him to the attention of Universal Studios. They were talking about doing Dracula as a film, and of course, Universal wanted Lon Chaney, who was the huge star at the time, to play Dracula. But he had recently passed away from throat cancer at the age of 47. However, even though Lugosi had starred on Broadway, had toured for 2 years, and had been a huge success, he was not their next choice.
Oh, interesting.
They went to Paul Muni, they went to Conrad Veidt, they were on the list. Lugosi was a contract player at one of the lower studios, William Fox Company, still playing small parts. He was not being considered.
Wow.
But he was determined. apparently going so far as to help Universal acquire the rights from Bram Stoker's wife at a reduced price, thinking that if Universal paid less and I helped them pay less for the rights, that maybe I can get the part. And he also sent Carl Laemmle, who was head of the studio at the time, letters and telegrams. Well, he finally got the part.
Persistence pays off, people.
He was cast, and he was called the new Lon Chaney.
Dracula was released in 1931, which was the same year that Lugosi became a U.S. citizen. His portrayal was so indelible to this day, it's what most people envision when they think of Dracula. And by the way, Todd Browning would go on to direct another horror classic, Freaks, in 1932, and redirected Lugosi again in 1935's The Mark of the Vampire.
I thought it was interesting in researching the making of Dracula. The cinematographer Karl Freund, whenever the camera would be on Dracula, his eyes were just, the light.
Yes.
Well, they had 2 pencil spotlights that they used to hit Bela Lugosi's eyes every time that he was on camera. So it was a kind
Which
of
gave it that really creepy effect.
a hypnotic
that's
stare.
So interesting.
Yeah. His son, though, says that when he was being disciplined by his father, that same stare would come out, and it would scare him into doing the right thing.
Don't mess with Daddy when he's got the look.
So with the success of Dracula, Universal wants, of course, more horror films, because if you do it once and it's successful, do it again and again and again. So they began pre-production on Frankenstein. Now, Lugosi actually tested for the part. There weren't any lines for it. He did a big makeup test. He didn't want to wear the makeup, and there weren't any lines. And so he turned it down.
Wow. Maybe rethink that one.
Yeah,
Bela.
maybe. Yeah. I mean, there are people that are quoted in some of the research saying if he had taken Frankenstein, it might have changed the trajectory to expand his horizons as opposed to limiting him to just playing Dracula pretty much.
Yeah, but you know what? His loss is Boris Karloff's gain.
Yes, exactly.
Because, of course, Boris Karloff ended up doing Frankenstein, and we're going to talk about him next.
Right. And Frankenstein was released 8 months after Dracula, and it was even more popular than Dracula. So they continued with more horror films, and Bela plays Dr. Miracle in Murders in the Rue Morgue in 1932. He's a carnival hypnotist who's really performing these horrific experiments on people. Now, that was not a success. And even though Dracula had been killer, Universal released him from his contract, and Boris Karloff became the new horror superstar.
It's really surprising thinking about all the money he made for Universal as Dracula. You would think that he would be viewed as such a moneymaker, important commodity.
Exactly.
Why would you let that go?
Yeah, and he was paid so little in almost all of the roles that he did. He does go on to do Island of Lost Souls in 1932 with Charles Laughton, but Charles Laughton is the one playing Dr. Moreau, not Bela. He just couldn't get that long-term studio contract. And because of turning down Frankenstein, he felt like he had made a big mistake. And so anytime a part was offered, he accepted it, which meant he ended up doing a string of cheap horror B movies.
Yes, he did, which is a little a shame when you look at his later career. The quality of movies he was making, not up to par of what he was used to. Right.
Now, he does have happiness in his personal life. The 51-year-old Lugosi marries 22-year-old Lillian Arch in 1933.
Well, nothing like a 22-year-old to make you happy.
Right. And he also helps to organize the Screen Actors Guild in the mid-30s, joining as member number 28.
And he also played a number of mad scientists. That was sort of his next go-to after Dracula. Right. In 1934, he appears in a number of films with Boris Karloff, who was sort of his rival for the king of horror, but by this point, Karloff had sort of broken out to become the bigger star.
Right.
He plays Dr. Vitus Vertigast in The Black Cat, 1934, and he's the hero.
Right.
Imagine that.
Yes.
It's based on an Edgar Allan Poe story, but doesn't follow the story. The Black Cat was another hit for Universal, but did very little to raise Lugosi's profile at the studio.
Right. Now, the following year, he appears with Karloff again in another Poe adaptation, The Raven, 1935. In 1938, Lillian and Bela have a son, Bela Lugosi Jr., who actually went on to become an attorney and whose legal case that he took on, Lugosi versus Universal Pictures, it led to the creation of the California Celebrities' Rights Act, which protects the likeness of celebrities after they have died. And I just want to give Bela Lugosi Jr. a shout out because he has a wonderful website that pays tribute to his father with just wonderful facts and stories, and just seems like a really terrific guy.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that he's now able to protect the image and the likeness of his dad.
I do too.
Yeah. Bela has a brief appearance opposite the great Greta Garbo in Ernst Lubitsch's comedy Ninotchka in 1939, and he had hoped that appearing in this comedy might break him out of the typecasting, but it wasn't meant to be.
Right. 1939, he's in Son of Frankenstein, where he plays Igor, a grave robber with a broken neck. And in 1940, he's in A Black Friday, but Lugosi has a relatively small supporting role.
And it's also in 1940 that Lugosi plays a phony spiritualist in You'll Find Out, which also co-starred Peter Lorre. And Lugosi plays a bitter cosmetics inventor in The Devil Bat.
Now, he makes a rare non-horror film appearance in The Saints Double Trouble, 1940, where he plays an international criminal opposite George Sanders, who plays the detective. Now, he also has a small role in The Wolfman, 1942, opposite Lon Chaney Jr., another one of our horror heroes. Of course, this was the role that made Lon Chaney Jr. into the latest monster star.
Lugosi reprised the role of Igor in The Ghost of Frankenstein in 1942, this time without Boris Karloff. Lon Chaney Jr. plays the monster.
And Lugosi continues working for more of the Poverty Row Studios, Monogram. He does The Corpse Vanishes in 1942. He plays a scientist who murders young brides to keep his wife alive. That's quite a log line.
That is quite a line.
Yeah. Bowery at Midnight, 1942, again, college professor by day and a criminal mastermind at night. And then the horror genre kind of takes a twist, and they start doing comedy horror.
Yes, which I love.
I did too.
Loved it.
So in 1943, he's in Ghosts on the Loose with, remember Leo Gorcey from the Bowery Boys
I loved
movies?
him.
And that actually features Ava Gardner in a supporting role.
Oh, wow. Good on Ava. Zombies on Broadway in 1945 starred comedy team Wally Brown and Alan Carney, who were trying to get a zombie for an opening night PR stunt. Well, of course, Lugosi plays a mad doctor who just so happens to have a zombie in his zombie-producing company.
Well, thank God.
Yes.
In 1945, he's in The Body Snatcher, directed by Robert Weiss, adapted from the short story by Robert Louis Stevenson. And then he reteams with the comedy team Brown and Carney in Genius at Work, 1946. Another one of those comedy mysteries. He goes back to playing Dracula in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein in 1948. That's along with Chaney Jr. as the Wolfman, and Glenn Strange plays the monster, Frankenstein.
Yes. I love that movie.
Yeah.
I remember it as a kid and just was thrilled.
Me too.
Abbott and Costello and monsters.
Oh,
yes, please.
It was just, it's like the Don Knotts movies, the Ghost and Mr. Chicken, or whatever that was. Was it Ghost and Mr. Chicken?
Ghost and Mr. Chicken.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Yes, I
Pulled
love
that one out of my ass.
From 1947 to 1950, Lugosi performed in summer stock, often in productions of Dracula or Arsenic and Old Lace. And during the rest of the year, he made personal appearances in a touring spook show and on early commercial television. In 1951, he did a 6-month tour of Dracula in London.
Right. Unfortunately, in 1953, he and Lillian Arch do end up divorcing, perhaps in part due to Bela's drinking. Now, he did check himself into a rehab facility around this time because of a medical addiction to morphine due to pain from sciatic nerve. He had an injury at a very late age in life. He did struggle with alcoholism, but he joined AA. And around this time, he meets someone when he's in rehab named Hope Lininger. She's 37 years younger than him. Apparently, she had been a fan, and she was writing letters to him when he was in the hospital recovering from his drug addiction. She would sign her letters, "A Dash of Hope."
Oh, how clever.
Yeah. And they ended up marrying and were married until his death in 1956.
Unfortunately, Bela Lugosi would posthumously appear in his last film, Plan 9 from Outer Space in 1957, which was directed by Ed Wood. It would go on to be considered one of the worst films of all time. And director Tim Burton would make a film about Ed Wood in which Martin Landau beautifully plays Bela Lugosi and wins an Oscar.
In an interview with Bela Lugosi Jr., he's quoted as saying, "The biggest misconception about my father, really, is in the focus and attention about him in the later years of his life, which obviously are not the best years of his life. And so that's what most people know about my father. Most people focus on the end of his career and focus on negative aspects. I'm very proud of how he was able to take charge of his life and lick a problem that he had, which I thought was a real...
That's so beautiful.
Yeah, real testament.
Very astute observation.
Yeah. Bela Lugosi died of a heart attack August 16th, 1956. He apparently died in his sleep, and he is buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City wearing one of his Dracula capes.
Of course he was, as he should be. And I may have possibly visited his grave a time or two.
Oh.
It's very cool. And in fact, the last time I visited it, somebody had taken those cheap plastic Dracula teeth
yes.
from Halloween and placed them on his tombstone, which I thought was very cool.
And by the way, he never ever wore fake teeth.
Yes.
As Dracula.
That's true.
Yeah. Well, I think it's time for this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz.
Yes. The question of the day, of course, it's going to deal with Bela Lugosi and also Boris Karloff, who we'll be talking about after the break. The question is, how many films did Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff make together? And there's a bonus points if you can name all of them.
Okay. I love that question.
Ooh.
We'll be right back with more on the horror heroes after this.
All right, Steve and Ed will be right back, but first another stop on the Hollywood tour. Continuing the theme of old Hollywood actors in horror films, actor Lon Chaney was affectionately known in Hollywood as the Man of a Thousand Faces. And when you see his work in 1923's The Hunchback of Notre Dame and 1925's The Phantom of the Opera, you can easily see why. His transformations into two very different, almost grotesque characters is amazing, and audiences were shocked at what they saw. So what's even more impressive is he did all of his own makeup. That's right, Chaney did all of his own outrageous makeup for both of those roles. He was very specific in his research as to how those characters were described in their respective source materials. For both Phantom and Hunchback, Chaney used wax, false teeth, and even grease paint to dramatically change his face. In fact, that famous unmasking scene in Phantom was so intense that newspapers of the day reported that, quote, women fainted, children cried, and grown men stepped outside theaters for fresh air. And now back to two people who don't need to change their faces, Steve and Ann from Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
Welcome back, everybody, to our Halloween episode. And before we get further into our next subject, which is Boris Karloff, I wanted to give a shout out to our listener of the week, Nigel Stoneman from Surrey, England. Nigel wrote us a beautiful email, really loves the show, really loves watching it. And he had an interesting chance to work with Esther Williams when she was promoting her book, $1 Million Mermaid.
Wow.
So that was an interesting story that he told in his email. So thank you so much for the email and thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening, Nigel. I am so excited to talk about this next fellow and the differences and the similarities between Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff.
Yeah, and there's really interesting differences and similarities in these two guys.
Right.
To kind of kick off Boris Karloff, I have to start on a personal note. And it sort of ties into our guest a few weeks ago was Peri Gilpin, which we all enjoyed having her here. She's a hoot.
Yes, we loved her.
We've been friends for over 20 years. Well, I believe it was 2003, she and her husband, Christian, bought Boris Karloff's house in Beverly Hills.
Oh my gosh.
And it's probably one of the most incredible homes I've ever been in my entire life.
Wow.
It was all original, probably built in the 20s, all stone. Everything was Gothic, and it looked exactly like the house that Boris Karloff should live in. But the cool thing about the house, down by the pool, and Christian and Perry did a lot of work on the house, and they did some really cool things with it. They restored a lot of things back to its original structure, but down by the pool, in cement, are the little feet print of Sarah Karloff.
Oh.
And he kind of stumbled upon them, and so he saved them, and he kind of blocked them out and lit it and just made it so beautiful. So it was kind of fun doing research with this, is I had a great conversation with Sarah Karloff about
how thrilling.
her father, and that we were doing the show, and she was
Yes.
excited about it. And I got to tell her that I have been in her father's house many, many times, and that her feet print are still there by the pool. She was thrilled to hear it, and was just so lovely and just just talked about how much she loved the house and had such fond memories of it. So, that's sort of my introduction to Boris Karloff, is just from being in his house with Perry and Christian.
I love that story.
I think anybody thinks about the Universal monsters, they think about Bela and they think about Boris. They're the two gods of Universal monster movies. Boris was born William Henry Pratt on November the 23rd, 1887 in Dulwich, England. His father was part Indian and worked for the Indian Civil Service. His mother's maternal aunt, and I find this so interesting, was Anna Leonowens, whose stories of life in the royal court of Siam, which is now, of course, Thailand, were the basis for the novel Anna and the King of Siam, which, of course, we all know went on to become the musical The King and I.
Right.
So he had a little famous aunt there. He was the youngest of 8 children, 7 boys and 1 girl, and both of his parents died when he was fairly young.
Okay.
So he was raised mostly by his older siblings.
After high school, he was forced to attend King's College to study to become a diplomat because they wanted him in something steady, right? Everybody
Like
wants
Bela.
their kid, like Bela. His real passion, though, was acting, which made him a bit of the black sheep of the family of civil servants. So finally, Karloff drops out of college, sets out to become an actor, much to his family's dismay. He flips a coin, he lands in British Columbia, Canada, and pursues a career in the theater. To make ends meet, he's working as a farmhand, a truck driver, and other odd jobs.
And starting around 1911, he snagged a part in a play in Canada by fibbing. He told the producers that he actually appeared in every single play he'd ever seen.
Oh my gosh.
And of course, back then, you couldn't really fact check. So
Right, no internet.
They thought, wow, this guy's really experienced on stage. So, of course, so he got the part. And it was also around this time that he adopted the stage name Boris Karloff. He stated that he chose Boris simply because he liked the name. It sounded foreign and exotic to him. And he said that Karloff was a family name. However, his daughter Sarah tried to find the name in the family genealogy and was unable to locate the connection.
Interesting.
So she thinks that he could have made it up.
He might have made it up,
Yes.
yeah. Well, it has a ring to it.
Yeah, it's a great name,
Yeah.
great stage name.
Yeah.
And he performed with many theater companies, which took him all throughout Canada. When he joined the Harry St. Clair Theater Troupe, he spent a year in North Dakota performing in various plays, including, and I love this, a stint as one of the ugly stepsisters in Cinderella.
That is hysterical.
I
would
love
wish I
that.
could see that.
Me too. He then joined another company, the Robert Lawrence Stock Company, which landed him in San Francisco in 1919. And something that was very natural for actors back then, he went to Hollywood
Yeah.
to give pictures a try.
Of course.
Can you imagine? I'll go to Hollywood and give pictures a try.
Yes. Yeah. Well, he does go to Hollywood. He struggles a bit, grabbing work as an extra whenever he can. And he actually is appearing in small roles in dozens of silent films. But the work is sporadic, and he often has to make up for it with manual labor, such as digging ditches or delivering construction plaster to make ends meet. According to Karloff, his first film was a Frank Borzage picture at Universal, for which he received $5 whole as an extra. His first confirmed appearance in a film was in a film serial, The Lightning Raider 1919 with Pearl White.
Oh, I love Pearl White. The Perils of Pauline. I think she was the original star of that.
Yeah.
The early version. Because of his East Indian heritage and his ethnic looks, he was limited a little bit by the roles available to him. He usually ended up playing characters who were Native American or Hindu or Arab, sometimes even a cowboy on occasion. But his first major role came in a film series called The Hope Diamond Mysteries in 1920. In this film, he plays the dual role of a Hindu servant and a high priest of Sita. His subsequent films had him playing everything from, and I love this, a French fur trader in The Deadlier Sex, 1920.
Okay.
A Western outlaw in The Hellion, 1923.
Right.
An Iranian holy man in Omar the Tent Maker, 1922, a Latino gangster in Dynamite Dan,
Wow.
1924, and best of all, an African tribesman in Tarzan and the Golden Lion, 1927.
So he was really
They
doing it all.
They made him the ethnic actor of the moment.
Right. Well, during a lull in his film jobs, he actually took a lead in a play called The Criminal Code in 1929. And how fortuitous the director of that play was not none other than Howard Hawks. And
Hawks turned it into a film.
the following year, and Karloff was cast, and to great accolades. And this bigger part and showier part meant better film roles for Karloff.
And while Karloff was working at Universal Studios, he was spotted in the studio's commissary by director James Whale. Whale, who had been looking for the right actor to portray the monster in his new production of Frankenstein, which was based on Mary Shelley's novel, when he caught a glimpse of Karloff in the commissary, he was fascinated by his expressive face.
Wow.
So he asked Karloff to join him at his table. He made a few sketches of his famous face, and the rest is history.
Right.
However, as you pointed out earlier, Lon Chaney Sr. was originally offered the role, but he died. And then, of course, Bela Lugosi was offered, but there were not enough lines for him, so he turned it down. So he was the perfect man at the perfect place to get this iconic role, and it changed his career forever.
Right.
Frankenstein, it was a smashing success, but Karloff was still such an unknown actor at the time that he wasn't even invited to the film's premiere.
Well, and with the makeup, even if he had been invited, you might not have known who he was.
Who would know who he is?
Yeah.
I know. I love that.
I love, though, that he was offered a role in Scarface in 1932, really splashy role, where he plays a brutal Irish gangster opposite Paul Muni. So the fact that he did Frankenstein and then Scarface with Muni, I mean, he was an overnight success at the age of 44 after 80 films. Oh my gosh.
I know, it's funny. Bela and Boris were both late bloomers.
They were both late bloomers.
They found their fame later in life, which is really wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, Universal, of course, they saw such potential in Boris Karloff, they immediately cast him in more horror movies, such as The Old Dark House in 1932 with Melvin Douglas, The Mask of Fu Manchu, 1932, and also The Mummy, which was his other iconic role.
Yes.
And this really cemented his stature as the king of horror movies. To me, it's a little bit ironic that he was known for these horrific monster roles, because in real life, he was anything but a monster. He was the kindest, gentlest British gentleman.
Yeah.
Well-educated, well-read, gracious, really warm-hearted. He had a great hobby and a great love for roses. He loved to grow roses. And he was a fervent cricket fan. So
I love that. Well, he did bring such heart to Frankenstein. Not that you can't play that, not that you have to have that in you, but he clearly found a way to make Frankenstein such a sympathetic character. So I love knowing that he was a good man.
Yeah, and jumping ahead a little bit, audiences loved him, especially children. Despite the horrific, horrible, scary makeup, children were just drawn to him.
Yes.
And I read a little article about why that was the case.
Yeah.
And many people felt like that kids really empathized with his character. The lonely, lost monster. And they really loved the monster.
Yeah.
And so, whenever he was around, kids just clamored to be with him, which is a beautiful thing.
That is. Well, Karloff became concerned about working conditions and long hours endured by actors on film sets. I bet he did after over, probably at that point, 100 films under his belt.
And how long for that makeup?
My goodness.
Can you imagine?
So he, along with a handful of other actors, started secretly meeting to form a union to help protect actors. This was in 1933, and of course, this was the beginning of the Screen Actors Guild.
Which Bela Lugosi was also a part of founding.
Exactly. They met secretly, often at Karloff's house. Other founding members were James Gleason, Lucille Gleason, Leon Ames, Alan Mowbray, and C. Aubrey Smith.
Some great character actors there.
I know it. Some favorites of this podcast.
But it's interesting, when I read about the formation of SAG, a lot of times it's stated that you'll notice in the lineup of actors who started it, not one major star.
Yeah.
It was all the working stiffs and the character actors.
Yeah, who were being abused.
Who were really probably being abused.
Yeah.
They're the ones who stepped up and said enough.
More classic horror films follow. He does The Ghoul in 1933, The Black Cat, as we mentioned earlier, in 1934, pairing him with Bela for the first time. And while they were friendly, they didn't really get to know each other very well socially. They were very professional with each other. And you can see in some of the promos for some of the films they did, they appreciated each other and made fun of each other. But they were not very close.
But audiences love seeing these two powerhouses together.
Yeah.
In 1935, Karloff donned the monster makeup again for The Bride of Frankenstein, which proved to be a colossal hit. He would go on to portray the monster in one more film, film, Son of Frankenstein, in 1939. And while some people felt that Karloff was typecast in these horror movies, he didn't seem to mind. He truly embraced his place in Hollywood. And he felt that if he's entertaining people and making people happy, then he's fulfilled.
Right.
And I love that he just embraced it.
I do too. And I think that was different than Bela. I think Bela really saw himself. And I'm sure they both had potential to do other things.
Yeah.
But Hollywood, unfortunately, only sees what they see.
I was thinking about Bela. If you start your career playing Macbeth and Hamlet, and the leading man, and then you get typecast as this horrible monster, that must be weird for your ego.
It really has to be. And just the lack of being able to use the gifts that you're given.
Your skills and your talent and your range.
Yeah. Now, in 1938, Karloff portrays Chinese detective Mr. Wong in the film Mr. Wong Detective, but he's cast as an Asian. Now, we would never cast a non-Asian in a role today, but remember, people, it was a different time, and the film was so popular that it spawned 4 other Mr. Wong films starring Boris.
Yes, and because of his popularity in the horror genre, Boris was offered a leading role in the play Arsenic and Old Lace.
Yes.
In the play, he portrays the ghoulish murderer Jonathan Brewster, who, and this is a very clever wink to the audience, he's given plastic surgery to look exactly like Boris Karloff.
I love it. I love it. It's such a fun thing.
Perfect.
Yep.
And the play was an enormous hit. It ran from 1941 to 1944, and director Frank Capra got the rights to make a movie version of it, and he filmed one in 1941, but because the play was still running on Broadway, he cast Raymond Massey in the role instead of Boris Karloff.
Right.
Because the play's producers allowed the film to be made, but under one condition, it could only be released after the Broadway play ended.
And I don't think they wanted to release Boris Karloff to shoot it.
Yeah, they wanted to have him on Broadway. So it's a shame he didn't get to play it in the film.
That would have been
Although
really fun.
Raymond Massey's great.
Yeah, he's terrific. So back in Hollywood, he leans further into his horror roots with films such as House of Frankenstein, 1944. He doesn't portray the monster in that one, but rather the evil scientist. He goes over to RKO to do 3 films: The Body Snatcher, Isle of the Dead with Ellen Drew, that's 1945, and Bedlam with Anna Lee.
And all of those were Val Lewton productions, who we've talked about before, doing when we talked about Cat People.
Yes.
That was part of his attempt to beef up RKO's horror division. By the late 1940s, he was so well known for his monster films that he began to have a little fun with it. He loved to have fun with the image, and he did comedies that sort of made fun of it.
Yes.
One in particular is called The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, starring Danny Kaye.
Love that.
And my buddy Ann Rutherford.
Right.
He's really funny in that. And also, Abbott and Costello Meet the Monster, Boris Karloff, 1948, which they originally, when he wasn't in it, it was just called Abbott and Costello Meet the Monster. But once he signed on, they added his name in the title, which was kind of cool.
You're going to get more people that way. He returns to Broadway in 1950. Now, this would be so fantastic to see.
Yes.
He's in a successful run of Peter Pan with Jean Arthur, and he is playing that dual role of Captain Hook and Mr. Darling, and he would be perfection in that.
Perfect. And how great would it be to see Jean Arthur flying around the theater?
Wouldn't that be fun?
Yeah, she's perfect.
Yeah.
Well, by the 1950s, he was a full-fledged horror film star and loving it, and he really embraced the image. He starred in The Strange Door in 1951 with Charles Lawton, The Black Castle in 52, and The Island Monster in 54. In 55, he returned to Broadway in The Lark by the French playwright Jean Anouilh. The play, which also starred Christopher Plummer, was about Joan of Arc, played by Julie Harris. For his efforts, Karloff was actually nominated for a Tony Award for Best Actor that year. He later recreated the role in a TV movie version in 1957. And also in the 1950s, he embraced television and radio and was very prolific in those mediums.
So by the 60s, there's this resurgence of horror films, and Karloff finds himself back in demand. How cool is that?
Yeah.
Although the budgets were cheaper, the production values were not as plush in the horror heyday of the 30s and 40s. He does, though, star in films like The Raven, 63, with Vincent Price and Peter Lorre.
Which is not to be confused with
the other Raven.
And they had nothing to do with each other, just happened to be named the same thing.
Yes. Well, it's a good title for a horror film, right? The Terror in 1963, featuring Jack Nicholson.
Yeah, there's some clips on YouTube. It's really fun to see a super young Jack Nicholson with Boris Karloff.
Die Monster Die, 1965, and Cauldron of Blood, 1968.
And during the 60s, he also began to embrace his scary screen image with a tongue-in-cheek playfulness. And this was demonstrated when he appeared in movies like The Comedy of Terrors, 1963, which once again reunited him with Vincent Price and Peter Lorre. And then the beach comedies, Bikini Beach in 1964, which starred Frankie Avalon and Annette Funicello.
Aww.
And one of the greatest titles of a movie ever, The Ghost in the Invisible Bikini, 1966.
Have you ever seen it?
No.
I've never seen it either.
Tommy Kirk and Deborah Whaley.
Oh. 1966, he is asked to provide the narration to the animated Christmas classic, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and to provide the voice of the Grinch. I mean, is there anything more iconic and delicious than watching? I can watch that every Christmas.
And his voice, that deep melodic baritone, is so perfect for that character.
Yes, you can't really hear or think of anyone else in that role.
No, at all. And he ended up winning a Grammy for Best Children's Recording.
So that's very cool. In 1968, he was cast in Peter Bogdanovich's feature film debut called Targets, which I just happened to catch a couple months ago.
I just watched this.
You did? Okay. What did you think?
Well, it's the strangest movie.
It's a very strange film.
In that there's two parallel stories going on. There's one story of this sort of clean-cut, all-American guy who turns out to be a serial killer.
Yeah.
And then there's the better story of Boris Karloff playing this has-been horror movie star who's just trying to stay relevant and trying to figure out his place in the world.
Yes.
And that storyline is really beautiful and really well done.
Yeah.
Well, they eventually merge at a drive-in movie theater, and I won't tell too much, but it's an interesting movie.
It's worth watching, I think.
It's worth it for his performance.
Yes. Yeah. And just, it makes you never want to go to a drive-in again.
Never. I think you can see that. I think it's available maybe on YouTube if you want to check it out.
Okay. So the last of his films to debut before his death was The Crimson Cult in 1968 with Christopher Lee. But that's not his final film, right?
No.
In the spring of 68, he appears in a series of 4 low-budget Mexican horror films. What an interesting genre.
It was a Mexican production company that hired him to do these films.
Okay. And they were produced here in Los Angeles for director Jack Hill. The films are Isle of the Snake People, The Incredible Invasion, Fear Chamber, and House of Evil. But they were all tied up legally, so they weren't released until after his death.
Yeah. So interesting. He had all these movies posthumously released. On a personal front, Karloff was married 6 times, something he had in common with Bela.
Yeah.
Bela liked the women too. He had one daughter, Sarah, who I mentioned earlier, by his 5th wife, Dorothy Stein. And he was with his 6th wife, Evelyn Karloff, from 1946 until his death in 1968. If you want to get a great sense of who Boris Karloff, the man, is, go to, and I think you can find this on YouTube, go to an episode of This Is Your Life. If people who don't know, it was a show where Ralph Edwards would surprise a celebrity and then basically retell his life and bring in people from the past and his 2nd grade teacher and all these unexpected people and really surprise a celebrity. Well, they do one for Boris Karloff. They bring in friends, they bring in colleagues, but you really get to see what a lovely, humble, intelligent gentleman he really was. It's particularly moving when this guy from this amateur theater company in Anchorage, Alaska shows up and talks about their time together, and he reveals that Boris Karloff donated his wages to provide a theater for their company.
Wow.
And Boris got really uncomfortable on the show, and he didn't want to talk about it. I think he was very uncomfortable that this man was trying to tell the world what a great thing he did. So I think he was a very humble person. And what can you really say about Boris Karloff? He was one of the greatest stars of the horror genre of all time, and his legacy is just rich and everlasting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, rest in peace, and thank you for scaring us as children.
Absolutely.
All right. What is the answer to this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz?
Well, the question was, how many films did Boris and Bela make together?
Right.
And do we know?
8.
Yes, the answer is 8 films together.
Right.
Bonus points if you can name them all.
Okay.
Which I could not. I had to look them up. They are The Black Cat, 1934. Gift of Gab, also 1934. The Raven, 35. The Invisible Ray, 35. Son of Frankenstein, 39. Black Friday, 1940, You'll Find Out, also 1940, and The Body Snatcher in 1945.
Wow. That's amazing.
What a body of work, those two.
I know, they really did. Happy Halloween, everybody. Thanks so much for spending this time with us. And we'll list a lot of these films in the show notes if you want to check them out during the Halloween season. We would also love it if you would give us a 5-star review and if you would follow us on social media. Our handle is @FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign, and we are on Instagram, Facebook, and you can watch the podcast on YouTube.
And as always, we love hearing from you. Please keep those emails coming. We can be contacted at info@FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com.
That's this week's Spooky View.
From Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
You've been listening to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign with Steve Cubine and Ann McNamara, the podcast that celebrates amazing stories of Tinseltown from its golden era. Join us next week for another episode and learn something else about Hollywood you probably never knew. Take a moment and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review, and tell your friends about us too. It'll help grow the podcast. Visit Steve's website at FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com. The executive producers are Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara. Executive producer and post-production supervisor Lindsay Schnebley. Associate producer and researcher John Price Ritchie. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows like The Box of Oddities and The Shallow End with Schnebley and Toth. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved. That's a wrap.
Okay, here we go. Woo!
All right.
Feeding.
All right.